When you look in the mirror, what do you see? Do you see the person who people tell you you are? Do you see your height, your weight, your skin color? Or do you see something still stuck in your teeth from what you ate last night? A few months ago, I lived and worked in New York, and I had an experience that made me have a good look in the mirror. The organization that I worked for, I was only the first Black and the first African to ever hold the position that I held. So naturally, I got stereotypes. Obviously, chicken is your favorite food, right? And oh, don't you love hip hop? So this wasn't the first time I had experienced discrimination, but it's the first time I sat down and reflected upon it and tried to understand, why do people discriminate? And I was sensitized to the social and economic injustices and the psychological impacts of discrimination. So what is prejudice? Prejudice are attitudes based on feeling. They're not based on any reason, they're not based on experiences, and definitely not research. Stereotypes are generalizations about a different group of people. People who are different from you, people who are the out group. And discrimination is a behavior manifestation of stereotypes and prejudice. So prejudice is not a new thing. It's as old as human civilization. And racial discrimination is the most commonly known, the most heated, and probably the most damaging. But there are other types of discrimination. There's ageism, there's sexism, there's discrimination based on sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. So why do people discriminate? Well, social psychologists tell us that people like to stay with familiarity. That is, they like to be with people who have similar thoughts like them, people who talk like them, and people who look like them. So, cognitive psychology also tells us that the brain at any given moment is absorbing millions and millions of tidbits of information. And the brain, in order to save on memory and space, needs to categorize this information. And sometimes these categories are prejudices and stereotypes. Have you ever given someone the up-down look, where in a split of a second, you form an opinion about them and you judge them? Now that is your brain being very efficient at its work, because you're able to form an opinion to know whether they're favorable or threatening, similar or different from you, inferior or superior, and sometimes just if you can be a friend to them. So there's a big toll that discrimination has on the human psyche. And I like to think about it like a paper cut. You see, when you get one paper cut, sometimes you don't even think about it. Sometimes you don't even feel pain. But if you get 10 paper cuts, or 20, or 30 paper cuts, now that is a sight and pain that you cannot ignore. Discrimination, especially subtle acts of discrimination, is like having paper cut, one after the other. Discriminative acts eat away at your confidence, eat away at your self-worth. Day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. So, I once had an interaction with a 4-year-old girl who was biracial. And so this is how the conversation went. She said to me, "Bernice, your skin is dark." I said, "Yes, it is." Then I asked her, "How about your skin?" And she said, "My skin is lighter than yours, but I don't like my skin. Sometimes when I take a bath, I try to wash off the color." And this particular conversation was saddening, but also quite enlightening to when these kind of messages begin to get to children who are very, very young. So, why do we discriminate? Discrimination is propagated by systems. Systems where we have belief systems, traditions, and when I think about our context here in Kenya, we have this thing called tribalism, where different ethnicities have conflict with each other, where maybe if you're from one ethnicity, you're not given the same opportunity as another person from another ethnicity. And so a lot of times we tend to think that discrimination is only something about race. But actually it's just about forming that negative attitude and that negative opinion about the other person, and then acting on that thought and that belief. On a positive note, I like to think of the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama, who broke the glass ceiling by being the first Black president of the United States. And the message that this sent to the world was that we can, that the systems that have existed are beginning to slowly break down and be favorable to all. Now, economic injustice is also something else that propagates discrimination. You find that a lot of these developed countries were built on the backs of slaves and persons of African descent. And you find that the power dynamic has really not yet shifted, even centuries and years later. It continues through economic hitmen who prey on weaker economies to keep the rich richer and the poor poorer. It continues through aid that does not empower, but aid that keeps people dependent and poor. And it continues through unequal trade agreements. Narratives also propagate discrimination. You find that from the time we're very young, we hear certain things from our teachers, our parents, from school, from the media. And I remember that the first ever movie I watched in a theater was Lion King 2. And in Lion King, the core message that I took out from it was that Africa is a jungle. And then years later, I watched Black Panther. And in Black Panther, the message I took out of it was that Africa was, yes, a jungle, but a place of technological advancement and progress. Now that is a message that I want to relate to, don't you? So lastly, the last thing that kind of propagates discrimination is our own need for survival. That human nature is at the very bottom of it, seeking self-preservation. So I like to watch nature documentaries. And when I watch these documentaries, there's one particular one where a lion is hunting a gazelle. And so we're shown the lion, it usually looks to see which gazelle is the weakest. And then from there, it will slowly move closer to the gazelle. After some time, chase it, capture it, kill it, and then eat it. I tend to feel that people who are marginalized, those who are in the minority, those who have less power, are the gazelle. And although people who are marginalized and people who are the minority feel like sometimes they cannot do something about it, I believe they can. I'm a pragmatist and an optimist, and I believe that whether you're the one holding the power and holding privilege, or whether you're the one needing to be empowered, there's something that you can do about your thoughts, your attitudes, and your behavior. So one of the ways that we can overcome discrimination is by becoming aware of our prejudices, our biases, and our negative attitudes. Because just like any habit, just like any bad habit, that's where you start, being aware and accepting. Then something else is you can empathize. Empathize as the person who's being discriminated against, and empathize as a person who's a discriminator. And thirdly, we really need to teach our children from when they're very young to tolerate differences, that differences aren't a bad thing, that diversity is actually positive and can be good. So discrimination affects all of us, whether you're black or white, regardless of your religion or your stature, your ability or inability. We're all primed to discriminate. But also, at the very bottom of our human need are the needs to be loved, understood, accepted, and respected. And because of that, how different do you think the world would be today if you would challenge your negative attitudes and your prejudices and your biases? How different do you think it would be if those who held privilege would use it for good?